today. I've enjoyed all of the panel discussions and the presentations, and hopefully much of what I talk about today will reinforce those concepts. My topic is not directed at underrepresented populations, but what we do know, and this is in particular for women, is that they want to better understand the process before they dive in. You know, they feel that it's mysterious and opaque. And so much of what I'm presenting today is actually sort of a compilation of presentations that we did recently at Deerfield at a Women in Science forum, and that was really, again, to help educate women, help demystify the process, help them understand what goes on the investment side to a certain degree. And then just, you know, before I start, I think it's important to provide a little bit of context about my background and what I've been doing recently, because it certainly has influenced the slides that I prepared today. The first is that I've spent my life in therapeutics, discovery and development, and I still work in therapeutics, so you will see that in the data and the examples in the slides, but I think much of the concepts that I'm talking about are applicable across all STEM areas. I joined Deerfield 3 years ago, so Deerfield is a healthcare investment firm. I have learned a lot about the world of investing in 3 years, but I am still mystified and confounded sometimes by that as well. So I'll work to demystify it, but I can't say that I'm an expert. I'm certainly not an investment analyst. And then finally, my experiences and what I share with you as lessons learned today are really informed by my time at Deerfield and the model we have. And so I'll just speak about that a little bit before I dive into the slides. Again, Deerfield is a healthcare investment firm. We invest across health services, devices and diagnostics, and therapeutics. We do public investing, private structured investing. We start companies. And then about 4 years ago, Deerfield dove into a new area, which is what I'm in. And what Deerfield recognized is almost all therapeutics on the market today have their origins in academic research. But, you know, as we have talked today, the interface between academia, where innovation is generated, and industry that ultimately creates those therapeutics is rather clunky sometimes. And we have this valley of death and funding between NIH funding and then when VCs come in. So Deerfield said, look, we want to bridge that gap. We want to provide the funding to bridge the valley of death, but not only do we want to provide the funding, we want to provide experience and expertise to surround a principal investigator to progress their work from innovation to actual therapeutics, so the funding and the team and the capabilities and the infrastructure to do that. So our model is different than a typical VC that takes a single concept and will build a team and infrastructure and capabilities around that. What we try to do is scale that such that we have agreements with institutions, 25 I think now, research institutions across the U.S. with pre-negotiated terms and agreements, and then we have built a team, infrastructure, and capabilities that we can deploy across multiple projects, and currently we have about 35 projects in a portfolio. So that's just a little bit of perspective, and then I want to just start here. This data, again, is therapeutics data, but I think what I'm talking about is similar in different industries. The numbers would be different, but the concepts would be same. So drug discovery and development is really, really hard, and it's really, really expensive. What you see here is that it can take over 13 years to get to one launched product and nearly $2 billion to do that. And typically, with the current attrition metrics, to get to one launched product, you have to start 24 projects at the beginning. So those are not great numbers. And anybody who is involved in this area, be it pharma, biotech, or investors, everybody is looking at how we can bend this equation. How can we do this faster? How can we do this cheaper? And very, very importantly, how can we increase our odds such that we wouldn't have to start 24 projects and spend all that money to get one? So certainly, we're also looking at what is the revenue opportunity on, once it's commercialized, because we have to have a good return on investment as well. So I want to talk a little bit about how we determine what are the projects that we actually fund. So what are we looking for when we fund those 24 projects, or hopefully less projects than that? So financial modeling is very important in the investment industry. This is really just building a theoretical representation of how much value or cash a company can generate, and then how much it's going to take them to get there. What's your return on investment? And investors use various versions of this all the time, and I think it's helpful. We get this question constantly from our PIs. It's very understandable, and from our TTO offices. What goes into these models? I want to understand what investors are looking at. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll focus on a couple of key areas. These models are oftentimes multi-tab and very, very complicated Excel spreadsheets, but the concepts are relatively simple. I won't show you any Excel spreadsheets today. I don't want to scare you. So really there are just really three big areas that are focus areas of a financial model. Revenue forecasting, like how much money can your product make? The R&D timeline and probability of success, and we're going to dig a little bit more into that because I think that's incredibly critical. And then the others are really just how much money is it going to take you to do this. So again, I want to talk about probability of success because it's incredibly important. Again, that gets to that you have to start 24 projects to get one launched project. So how do we address this at Deerfield? Well, one of the ways that we address this is to do a very thorough review of the opportunity or the proposal that's being presented to us. And we do this in sort of three steps, if you will. There's a triage step where we're looking at some really high-level criteria to say, does this idea make sense to us? And if it does, then we go into a deeper scientific assessment to really pressure test that idea and some of the elements of it. And those two pieces are really the scientific evaluation. Does this science make sense to us? If it does, then we will kick off an investment evaluation where we look at a number of different factors. So we'll talk a little bit more about each of these. The first step in the scientific process is what we call the triage, and it's informed off of a proposal concept sheet, which is really just a one-page application that a PI puts in. And we look at several things, 5 things in fact, to say, do we think this idea makes sense? So we look at genetic evidence, we look at biological rationale, the relevance of the MOA to the indication, and those things are all related to probability of success. And then we also look at unmet need and the novelty, or how does this relate to the competitive landscape. So this is really a science evaluation, but those two things are essentially a commercial red face test for us to say, does it make sense to move forward? If it does, then we go into a deeper evaluation, and that deeper evaluation looks more at the science and pressure tests that, but it also looks at some of the things that are in place. Again, these are therapeutics, so from a pharmacology perspective, do we have the right tools in place to actually execute on the program? Can we take this idea and test it effectively? Do we have the right assays? Do we have the right screens, the right models in place? Do we have molecular equity? Is there any chemical matter that we can actually test, or do we have to start at ground zero? Are there biomarkers that would allow us to test this in the clinic? Do we know anything about tox? And usually we don't know anything about developability, but we can envision a clinical and regulatory path. So the first piece is this a good scientific idea? And the second piece is, can we actually execute on this idea? There are lots of good ideas, but they are not actually something that you can execute on. So we look very closely at that. And just a different representation of this is sort of a decision tree that we use. Again, the first is sort of genetic evidence. Is there evidence genetically that links the target to the indication? If there isn't, then we need some sort of other evidence and validation of that target before we would move forward. If that evidence isn't sufficient enough, we don't move forward with the project. We also look at biology, as I spoke about before. So is this some kind of validated mechanism, and do we have the tools to actually execute on it? Again, this all gets back to probability of success. If it is not a proven mechanism, do we have a defined mechanism of action? Does it have strong rationale? And finally, therapeutic tractability. Do we have any chemical matter? If not, do we have a path to get that? Or based on our experience and expertise, is that going to be untractable? So again, just a different representation of how we would evaluate projects. And I want to talk a little bit about genetic evidence, because we have placed a high premium on that. You've seen that now in a couple of slides, and it's sort of our first filter at Deerfield. And why is that? So if you look at the metrics of phase 2 and phase 3 failures of therapeutics, you can see that primarily those are because of safety and efficacy concerns. And those are huge failure rates due to safety and efficacy. And most of those are linked to the mechanism of action. So they are linked to how that drug works at the target site of action. And we know then, via some seminal work that Matt Nelson, who used to be the head of genetics at GSK and is incidentally the head of genetics at Deerfield Management, is that if we can link and see genetic evidence between the target and an indication, that improves our probability of success by almost 2.5-fold. Those are huge, huge numbers. If we go back to the beginning, what does that mean? That means that we'd have to start maybe 10 projects to get to one launched project if we can improve our probability of success by that much. That's a lot less money for a pharma company. That's a lot less money for an investor. Those are incredibly meaningfully improvement in odds. So that is why we focus on that filter. I think similarly, this is a little bit of an extreme example, but again, it just displays the importance of improving probability of success and why we look at it. So here we have cost and number of programs. If we have a novel target where we don't have any validation, it means it's not de-risked at all. From a cost perspective, to get to one asset that has successfully made it through phase 2, we'll have to spend about $40 million, and we'll have to run, let's say, 400 programs to get to the point where I think it's actually about four successful phase 2 programs. Those are huge attrition metrics. If we can de-risk the biology and we have some level of validation, you see in sort of the proven, we only have to start 2 programs to get to one successful phase 2 program, and we only end up spending about $11 million. So these are dramatic differences in what it costs to do research, and that is why we focus so heavily on increasing probability of success and seeing how much risk we can eliminate out of the process. And then just to bring it back to the model, so if you are looking at an investment model for a company with a single clinical stage asset, and let's say that you have valued that company at $100 million, but you look at the likelihood of clinical and regulatory success, and you say that likelihood is 50%, you have just taken the value of that company down to $50 million, right? So that we actually build into our models, and then that clearly is the numerator and impacts the return on investment that you can expect overall. So it has a very, very real place, and I think oftentimes people don't think of it as much as they should. As an innovator, anything that you can do to develop a data package that has a lot of de-risking in it is a good thing to do before you go before investors. And you know, this is just how investors sort of visualize the process as we go through all of the stages of discovery and development. We are de-risking at every stage. We frequently talk about value inflection points in addition to de-risking the process. Value inflection points are where the market would actually ascribe value to something in a real way. They might license it, they might purchase it, they might want to own a company. And those tend, in the therapeutic space, tend to be when you have efficacy in animals. A couple of years ago when we had a really hopping market, oftentimes investors would pay for assets that only had efficacy in animals. We have a much tighter market now, and so the real value inflection point most of the time at this point is when you have clinical proof of concept or some positive clinical data. So the market conditions certainly impact where investors are willing to opt in and provide real capital. This is just a representation of the discovery and development process, and again, just to drive home, the purpose of this process is to de-risk the project as you go through. Each stage has criteria that you have to meet to get to the next stage. We leverage this process to inform all of our projects. All of our projects' experimental plans are designed to answer the criteria that we need to answer in each of these stages. We have benchmark data on costs and timelines, and so all of those become inputs to the model. Sort of what does it take to get a product? All right, so I want to talk just specifically in our model, what are some of the top reasons why we reject proposals that we see? And you saw earlier that in our process, we had reviewed over 400 proposals. So we have seen a lot of proposals. And our top 5 hit list, I went to our team that does the actual review of all the proposals and asked them to give me the top 5 hit list. So what are those? Well, the first is a lack of robust target validation. Again, in our instance, if you don't have genetic validation and you don't have other levels of validation, that becomes a real problem for us. Some of the other issues that we see are just incomplete evidence. People come with sort of light packages that they think are indications of target validation, but when you're putting real money against this and you see those attrition metrics and how important probability of success is, oftentimes we want a more robust package in terms of target validation. We see a lot of PIs relying on correlational evidence rather than causational evidence, and that is something that certainly doesn't work. Oftentimes in the therapeutic space in particular, there's sort of a lack of recognition of how toxicity can play out. If you have a target that is sort of ubiquitously expressed, it means that it is quite critical for a number of different processes in the body, and if you're going to inhibit that target, it could have a lot of tox liabilities. And sometimes we just don't see sort of a recognition of that, and that represents a real risk for us. A lack of clinical strategy is really one of the biggest things that is a problem for these. And the reason is the clinical piece of discovery and development is by far the most expensive, and it really is the killing fields of therapeutics, if you will. That's where much of the attrition happens. And it's where most investors lose a lot of money in the clinical space. So you want to be sure that you actually can have a clinical strategy, and that means that you can identify patients. You have a way of finding patients to actually run a clinical trial. A great example of this is immuno-oncology agents. So that's a super hot area right now, and we get tons of immuno-oncology proposals, and we fund nearly none of them. And the reason is it is extraordinarily difficult to find those patients at this point. There are so many competitive trials and competitive agents out there. You would spend a tremendous amount of time and money trying to even find patients to run the clinical trial. So it's just practicalities like that. Do you have a biomarker that helps you identify patients in which your asset would have the highest likelihood of success? That is very important. So you can run smaller trials. Nobody likes to run big trials. They take a long time. They cost a lot of money. So anyway, that is a hugely important piece of the puzzle. We also see a lack of differentiation from existing approaches. Oftentimes PIs will come and say, look, they either haven't done their homework on what is in the market, or they say, look, my idea and my approach are differentiating. But when you look at that in a clinical setting, it's not meaningful. It may be meaningful at a mechanistic level, but it doesn't play out in a clinical way. And so there wouldn't be enough meaningful differentiation. And then lastly, just, you put a couple of these risks together, and risk stacking is a real problem, and we often see that. So anyway, the top 5 hit list, and a lot of these, particularly the top 3, have to do with probability of success again. So I cannot stress that enough. I want to talk a little bit about revenue forecasting, just to help people understand, how we go about that. So in order to forecast revenue, you need to know what the product that you would ultimately be selling would look like. And the way that we do that is to define a target product profile, right? And so this really talks about what does that product look like, what is the added value. We try to be pre-specified and measurable about many of those attributes. This is something that the team creates at the beginning of a project, and it definitely evolves as you get more data, either from your own project or from the market. But it really is sort of your guiding North Star of what you're trying to achieve. And I just want to show you an example of what that looks like in the therapeutic space. Here we have an example for ischemic stroke. So we first of all want to define what the modality is. Are we going after a small molecule, or are we going after an antibody? Those are extremely different approaches. What is the indication that we are going after? That will help define the patient population, which is a little bit more granular. We typically define these, as you can see, in terms of what is ideal on the right and then what is minimally acceptable on the left. So in the patient population, you can see here that it would be sufficient to give something with TPA. In an ideal situation, we would want to be able to replace TPA. So you want to be able to define these. And then we go through a lot of other things in terms of dosage forms, how would you administer this, etc. A lot of this will play into cost of goods ultimately. A lot of this will play into the likelihood of providers to prescribe this for their patients. Depending on the indication, if they may not want to give an IV formulation, they might want to give an oral formulation, for instance. But anyway, for therapeutic or whatever you're doing, it is incredibly important to define what you expect your product to look like. It will help with revenue forecasting, which we'll talk about in a second, and also define your experimental plan. So in terms of revenue forecasting, we sort of look at 3 things. The first is market size. So what is the total count of patients represented by what you're looking to treat? So what is the total number of ischemic stroke patients, if you will? And so you typically look at epidemiological data to define that. So, insurance claims, there's a lot of information in the literature. You can look at prescription data if you have access to that. So what is that total market size? But we know that you will, if there are 1 million ischemic stroke patients across the world, you will not be able to treat all of those for a variety of reasons. Some of it is just geography and the state of healthcare in certain countries, or certain indications, there may be good standard of care, right, that addresses certain patients' needs effectively, such that they don't really feel an unmet need. We talked earlier about it has to be necessary, not a nice to have, and in some of those cases, the standard of care is effective, and there isn't a necessary need. It would be a nice to have, but not enough. You may get situations where, we're looking at a population of autistic children for one of our assets, and the question we ask clinical providers is, if we created this product, would you use it, or would you just leave your patients untreated because they're pediatric patients and you just feel more comfortable not even treating them and dealing it with some behavioral modifications, let's say. So anyway, there's market size and there's market share, which you need to understand, and then of course pricing is extremely important. You take all of these together to define your revenue. And At Deerfield, we actually have an entire business unit with an epidemiology group, a market research group, and a pricing and reimbursement group to do all of this research for all of our investments. So it's incredibly important. Okay, so if we go through all of that exercise and we build an investment model, and it is fortunate enough for us to reach the threshold that we've defined for our investors and we actually fund a project, it goes into our system, and as I said, we have about 35 of those. But I also wanted to just provide for those where we have partnered with academic collaborators, what are some lessons learned or what are some observations that we've seen in those partnerships with our academic PIs? So the first for us is to remember that the goal of translational research is what I talked about earlier, to mitigate risk as you go along the way, to create value and progress that project through the stages of discovery and development. The goal of the research that we do together is not for funding of your lab's basic research or publication. And we see this come up all the time because we provide capital to PIs, and understandably they are very, very focused on grant money in their lab, and so when we talk about an experimental plan, we end up with an experimental plan that has tons of basic research in it. And none of that research is directed at mitigating risk and moving through the discovery and development process. And so that we have to have a lot of conversations about that because we have investors that invest in our funds, and we have defined our funds as investing in translational research and not basic research. And so that's a conversation that we have to have quite a bit with our investigators, and we certainly understand that there's a dynamic tension there. You know, the other thing that I would suggest, and I think this follows from the need to get funding for your lab, but when you're talking about translational research, focus your lab on what you can uniquely provide and look to access the other expertise that you need in other ways. At Deerfield, we provide that. We provide that in terms of pharmacology, in terms of toxicology, in terms of drug metabolism and pharmacokinetics and medicinal chemistry and CMC. So we surround that PI with those capabilities because we know that's not what the PI can uniquely provide. They can provide typically that foundational biology. And so you're a lot better off if you're really interested in translating your research, finding expertise to complement what you can uniquely provide and focus on that. You know, the other thing to recognize, and I think somebody spoke about this earlier, I think maybe it was Linda, but investors are very focused on maintaining optionality and optimizing value. So I grew up in pharma, I spent a lot of my time in pharma. Pharma is extremely focused on crisp decision making and executing on that decision. And the world of investing is incredibly different. If you're always looking to optimize value, you want to leave your options open. And so what can this mean for investors or investigators? I think this means ultimately that the path that you embark on can look very different as it evolves from what you envisioned. You know, we have cases where an investigator has been working on a target in a particular indication for many years, and we actually think that the value is much higher in a different indication. Maybe there's a bigger patient population, maybe there's better genetic evidence for that. So we may actually pivot, as Linda talked about, to that different indication, and sometimes that can be difficult for investigators. Sometimes the way that the asset is ultimately commercialized is different than what a PI had envisioned. You know, maybe they had envisioned starting their own company and being the CEO of that company, and for a variety of reasons, that may not be the optimal path. Maybe there are terrible market conditions as we're seeing today, and maybe, you know, the risk is high enough that if you can get good money with somebody licensing that asset, that might be the better path. So you just have to recognize that investors are about optimizing value, which may look different than the path that you envision. And then the last, I think, is quite obvious. All of you know about intellectual property. All of the PIs that we work with know about the importance of intellectual property, and yet we still find instances where they inadvertently disclose it, typically not in publications, but oftentimes in presentations that people are making everywhere. So you do need to be extremely, extremely cognizant of that. Okay, I'm just going to finish up with a few slides here, and this has been talked about in a number of ways, but I'll share with you sort of a case study representation that we prepared to talk to PIs at the institutions that we partner with to help them understand the different pathways of commercializations and sort of the puts and takes of those. So we have 3 hypothetical PIs, Anna, Ben, and Clara. They all, in our example, sort of start from the same place. They have a genetically validated target. We love those. They actually have chemical matter. My goodness, how wonderful. And there are actually several different options that they could follow. They can start their own company, go the traditional venture capital route, or we love the Deerfield Research Collaboration. So I'll just go through these quickly because, again, I think these have been discussed previously, but there's a tremendous amount of stuff that goes into creating a company beyond just having the idea. You know, you obviously have intellectual property, but you need to, beyond just creating it, figure out how you protect that and build a clear fence around that. There is fundraising, and more fundraising, and yet more fundraising that you need to do, and many of those you get turned down. You have to think about just the legal aspect of even forming a company. Are you going to have labs? Do you need to find lab space? Do you need to find a team? What is your company ultimately looking like? Is it a single asset company? Is it a platform company? Do you need to go out and find other things to add to that company and do business development? So there's a tremendous amount of work, and we heard today about some phenomenal resources that PIs can use to help them through this process. But at the end of the day, it is a lot of work, and it's difficult probably to maintain a good balance between your academic research and this. But many people do this and do this very successfully. You can go the traditional venture capital route, and one way that this plays out is a venture capital route, either by talking with Ben or by reading the literature or understanding what's going on. Says, hey, we want to start a gene therapy company or a protein interaction company or something. We're going to bring in an entrepreneur in residence to help us work up a business plan for this. We think it's good enough. We're going to provide seed funding, and we are going to create a company shell. And maybe then Ben's asset and Ben himself are dropped into that company shell and become part of the company. Ben may have a number of different options for how he wants to be involved. Potentially he could be an officer or a CEO of the company. He may be able to join the scientific advisory board if he doesn't want to go full on as an officer. He may even say, look, here's my idea, you license it, I'm going back to academia, and call me when you need some consulting. So he does have a number of different options, but even if he wants to be very involved, it's the VC's company. He is a part of that company. He has a voice, but he is not directing and driving in the same way as if he had started his own company. But the beauty is that the VC does provide a lot of the infrastructure, funding, etc. In our case, as I mentioned before, it's a riff on the venture capital model, if you will. We try to do this in a scalable and efficient way. So we would partner with a PI. What we don't do right away is create a company. So we don't create a company that we have to hire a management team for, build infrastructure and capabilities for, etc. We bring them into our sort of Deerfield discovery and development ecosystem, and our team sort of serves as that management team, if you will. That allows us to de-risk these assets, to create value before we make the investment of creating a new company, hiring a management team, building labs, etc. But similar to the VC, it allows, we provide all of the infrastructure, we provide all of the capabilities, we provide the funding, and the PI is able to stay involved in a collaborative way. They are part of the team, they are not the driver, but they are definitely part of the team. So anyway, that's our model, and really this is just to say that there are different paths, and I want to echo what somebody said earlier. I can't remember which panelist or speaker, but it's really all about understanding the options available to you. Not all of these options may be available to you based on your invention, but understanding what options are available to you and what is important to you. If you are Anna, it's important to you to drive that company and own that company, but what you may have to give up is your academic lab. That's extremely difficult to balance. If you're Ben, you like a nice balance and you say, look, I want to be involved, but I want to maintain my academic lab, and maybe this is the route for me. We obviously play up the benefits to Clara because we like our model. But really, the important thing is just to be clear about what's important to you and think about that with regard to the path that you want to follow. All right, I think I'm out of time, and I just want to say, I'm not going to go through slides on telling your story. People have talked about that, but I just want to say maybe two things with regard to telling your story and going out and pitching and talking to investors. And the first is that there are a multitude of investors, and all of these investors have different things that they invest in, right? They have different focuses of their investment, and even those that are focused on the same things, they all have a different way of thinking. Everybody uses financial modeling, but there are a lot of assumptions that go into financial modeling, and one firm may use very different assumptions than another firm. And so I think it's important to recognize that ultimately, if you have a good idea, there is likely a fit for you out there. You may have to try on many investors before you find that one that is a good match. You've all heard stories of entrepreneurs who've been turned down 50 times, right? That may happen, but it doesn't mean that they're cookie cutters. Every investment firm thinks differently. Every investor within every investment firm thinks quite differently. So, try a number of them before you get too discouraged. And, take their feedback as well. The other thing I will say is no does not mean no forever. Even if you go out at a first round and you can't find funding, listen to what they say, go back and collect the data that they have encouraged you to collect. That will help your probability of success, that will help your credibility, but other things change too. The market changes, right? Just market conditions change. The state of science and whatever field you are in changes, and those things change investors' viewpoints. So lots of things can change, and no doesn't mean no forever. So I'm going to pause there and take any questions that anybody has.
In the interest of time, we will have to halt on the questions, but Jana will be here. She will be here, and we have a whole networking opportunity right after this. So let's thank your very informative presentation today. Let's thank the speaker.